This tutorial is sponsored by Envato Elements. Welcome back guys to another photo manipulation tutorial on my channel. Today's video is a bit special as I'll be covering my very first movie themed artwork. By the way, I make videos about editing, visual effects and compositing, so if that's your kind of things, make sure you subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Let's start by opening Adobe Photoshop, create a new document. This is the standard resolution I usually go for. Start by importing the first background photo. I'm not gonna use the entire image, so let's crop it down to a smaller section because I want to see more details. Rotate it a bit, give the layer a descriptive name. The first thing I want to do here is establish the overall look and feel of the composition by adjusting the color. So add a curves adjustment layer, switch to blue, bring the curves down slightly. We can also add a hue and saturation adjustment layer. This is pretty much the tone I'm going for. Let's bring the saturation down a bit. Now let's switch to cyan, change it to green, bring the saturation and lightness down. I think it's still brighter than it needs to be, so let's add levels, adjust the midtones, and bring the white output down. Now we're ready to bring in one of the biggest and most important elements in our scene, the train wagon, which I downloaded in high quality from Envato Elements. Now usually whenever I need such an image, I spend a long time trying to find the right one online. The biggest challenge is to find something that matches the perspective of my scene and is easy to mask out, but not this time thanks to today's sponsor Envato Elements, which offers a huge library of stock images, graphic assets, motion templates, and pretty much everything you need to get creative projects done. Now my favorite category on Envato Elements is 3D objects. The 360-degree preview allows me to generate still images at any angle from 3D objects to get the perfect perspective that fits my scene. The frames are available to download in PNG with full transparency, which makes them ready to use and perfect to drop onto any composition with zero masking effort. And that's exactly where I got most of the elements which I'll be using in this video. There are thousands of various 3D models on Envato Elements, which you can download instantly to use in your projects. Envato Elements hosts a massive library that features millions of creative digital assets, including high quality and royalty-free stock photos, sound effects, fonts, templates, and pretty much anything you need to speed up your workflow. You can download unlimited assets with just a single fee, which is really affordable and comes with a 50% off discount if you opt in for the yearly subscription. So make sure you check Envato Elements now using the link in the description box. Now back to the tutorial. Let's scale the train wagon up to bring it closer, rotate it counterclockwise to match the background's perspective, rename the layer. I want to get rid of this part here, so let's use the eraser to remove the part that's on the outside. There's still a small section that overlaps with the train, and you can simply use the clone stamp to get rid of that. Next thing we need to do here is match the exposure and colors, so let's add levels, right click and create a clipping mask to make sure it only affects the layer that comes directly below it, which is the train in our case, and adjust the settings to darken it by decreasing the midtones as well as the white output. I think that looks good enough for now. Let's focus on building the portal next. I'm not gonna bother creating this from scratch as I found the perfect image for it through a simple Google search, and I'll leave links to all assets in the description below. You can scale it down on the x-axis separately by holding down Shift on your keyboard. I think this is a perfect position for it, and since the background is completely black, switch the blend mode to screen to turn the transparency on. I want to readjust its position a bit. We still need to get rid of the bottom parts, add a layer mask, and with the mask selected, use the eraser tool to eliminate unwanted areas of the image. Using the layer mask here gives us a huge advantage in case we decide to bring erased parts back later on. The color can be adjusted a bit, so let's add a hue adjustment layer on top. Bring the saturation up. Nice. Let's not forget to bring in the other side of the portal here. So let's bring in this image below the portal, resize it properly. I'm gonna call this dimension, add a layer mask, and erase the outer areas to fit the image within the portal itself. Now I want to change the look of this image a bit, so let's add a hue adjustment layer, create a clip-in mask, slide the hue to green, bump up the saturation, bring the lightness down. Let's add an exposure layer this time, create a clip-in mask, and my aim here is to darken the image a little bit. Alright, looking good. And for the sake of keeping our project clear and organized, let's select all the portal layers and group them inside one folder. Let's call this one portal group. Not sure if you can see it, but it seemed like I didn't mask the other side of the portal properly. So let's go back to its mask and clean this part up. Perfect. Now moving on to the main subject, I'm using a really cool portrait of my friend Sammy here, which was shot by the very talented Rock Raven. If you're recreating this, you can always use your own image, and as usual, don't forget to share your final result with us on Discord or simply tag me on Instagram. Before confirming the layer, you can set the opacity to 50% so you can have a better understanding of where it sits within the composition. Once you're happy with it, bring the opacity back up and hit confirm. Now of course, first thing we need to do here is get rid of the background, and since we have a very well defined subject here, let's go to select subject to get a quick assistance from Photoshop. The selection looks pretty accurate, so let's hit create layer mask. I can still see some imperfections around the edges, but no need to worry, we can clean that further. With the mask selected, switch to the brush tool, make sure the foreground color is set to black, and proceed with erasing the remaining pixels around the edges. And keep in mind that you can always change the foreground color to white for an opposite effect if you ever need to restore erased pixels. Let's add the model layer inside a new folder, and just like any newly added layer, let's proceed with color matching. First of all, let's use curves to darken the image a bit. Remember to create a clip-in mask here. Maybe I'll readjust this slightly. Now switch over to the blue channel. Let's bring the midtones up a bit. Add a hue adjustment layer. I think some colors here are a bit oversaturated, so let's reduce that. The skin tone is also a bit off, so let's add another hue and saturation layer. Adjust the hue, bump up the saturation. It's clearly affecting the whole image right now. However, I want to apply this on the face only. So select the layer mask, hit Ctrl-I on your keyboard to invert, and use the brush to reapply the saturation effect on the face. Okay, I think that looks pretty good, except that it's a bit too bright for the scene, especially that we don't really have a light source anywhere near the face. So let's add a brightness adjustment layer here, create a clip-in mask, bring both brightness and contrast down, invert the mask, and reapply the effect around the face and shoulders area. Let's see how that looks. Alright, that looks pretty good. Next thing I want to work on here is edge highlights, which is really crucial whenever you have any kind of light source behind your subject. There are several ways to create highlights in Photoshop. To keep it simple, let's add a new hue and saturation layer. This time enable colorize, increase the saturation. Maybe I'll slide the hue closer to orange, invert the mask, and using a small brush, start painting real close to the edges all around the subject. I think it's barely visible, so let's adjust the saturation, the lightness as well, and let's continue adding highlights all along the edges of our model, except for parts which are further away from the light source. And you can always readjust the highlight settings depending on your image and the nature of light source behind it. If the light source is too harsh and close, you can always add another level of highlights that can be a bit softer and spreads more. So add another hue adjustment layer. I'm gonna go ahead and match the hue to that of the portal as much as possible. This time change the blend mode to screen, invert the mask, and using a bigger brush, start repainting highlights around the model since our portal is emitting some really intense orange light, therefore resulting in much more light spillage. I think the initial highlights became a bit too harsh, So let's go back and fix that. Cool. Maybe I'll add more soft highlights around here. And to be able to differentiate the layers, let's give each of them a proper name. Alright, I think that looks pretty good for now. We're not done with the model yet. Let's add an exposure layer, create a clip-in mask, bring the exposure down, invert the mask, and simply paint around parts which are in contact with the train to add some sort of a shadow effect. Before moving on, I think I want to emphasize on the highlights even more. It does look more convincing now. And another thing we need to add here to achieve a higher level of realism is shadows. So create a new blank layer below the model, set the color to black, and using a small brush, paint a harsh shadow really close to the contact areas. There are many techniques that you can use in Photoshop to create shadows. Keeping it really simple here since I don't need any complex or well-defined shadows. Let's decrease the brush opacity and paint long shadows on the surface here. Of course, this will depend on the light direction in your scene. The idea is pretty simple. Harsher shadows closer to the contact area and much softer shadows as we move further. Alright, I think that looks really good for now. Let's go all the way back to the city image. To bring in more action and movement to the scene, let's add motion blur, adjust the angle, increase the distance to 50 or so. And since the image is supposedly far in the distance, we can add lens or Gaussian blur, set the radius to 2 and hit OK. And now we can focus on adding extra elements and details to the scene, starting with this helicopter. Let's rename it. It's naturally moving at a really high speed, so let's add motion blur, adjust the angle, set the distance to 15. Same thing here, let's add a bit of Gaussian blur. Alright, looking good so far. Let's add curves and increase the blue midtones to match the rest of the scene. We can enhance that further by adjusting the exposure, bring that down, adjust the offset as well as the gamma. I'm happy with this look. I think it blends in very well with the sky in the distance. And as usual, group all the helicopter layers together in one folder. Now I want the scene to be even more dramatic, so let's bring in this PNG explosion image, bring it to the corner over here, hit enter to change the name. I want to adjust the colors a bit, so hit Ctrl+U on your keyboard to bring up hues and saturation adjustments. Let's bump up the saturation to see more of that orange color. Again, let's add motion blur, set the distance to 60, and finally we can add a bit of Gaussian blur to it as well. Perfect. I think the background part is sorted, so let's organize all these layers in one folder. One important detail I missed here is to add some luminance on the train's surface caused by our portal here. So let's add a hue layer, create a clip-in mask, enable colorize, change the hue to orange, increase the saturation, the lightness a bit. This time let's change the blend mode to overlay, invert the layer mask, and using the brush tool start painting around this area over here. I think I want to adjust the hue settings a little bit. Much better. However, I think this adjustment brought up a small flow with the portal here. The masking is a bit off, so let's go back to the portal layer and bring some of it back right around the bottom here. What else? I think I want to darken the front side of the train since there's less light reaching that area. So add an exposure layer, bring the exposure down, invert the mask, and using the brush tool, bring the darkness effect back around the front area over here. Cool. I believe there's not much more we need to do here with the train itself, so let's group all of its layers in one folder. Next, let's bring another explosion image here, scale it up, add motion blur, set the distance to 90, and naturally explosions mean intense orange luminance on surrounding objects. So let's add a hue layer all the way on top, enable colorize, increase the saturation all the way up, slide the hue to orange, and switch the blend mode to screen, invert the mask, and paint around the explosion. Let's bring the hue even closer to that of the explosion, decrease the lightness a bit. Let's see how that looks. Great, let's move this out of this folder. We're not done yet. To spice things up, let's bring some sparks over. I have the right graphics for this, and to get rid of the black background, let's switch the blend mode to screen. I don't need this to be all over the scene, so let's add the layer mask and use the eraser to eliminate some sparks around the center, maybe from the bottom corner here as well. Now remember that just like the explosions, the sparks are supposed to be moving real fast, so to make things a bit more natural, let's add motion blur. That looks a bit too high, so bring the distance down to 12 or so. Actually, I want to get rid of even more sparks around the bottom here, as it's a bit distracting. I do want to add another layer of sparks closer to our view here, so let's drag another image over, scale it up to fill the frame, rename the layer, and change the blend mode to screen as usual. This time around, I want to keep sparks on the right side only, so let's add motion blur. This time let's set the distance to a higher value, and since these sparks are supposed to be much closer to the camera, we can blur it out a bit simply using Gaussian blur. Set the radius to 8 or so and then hit OK. I think I just want to move it over to the right a bit, so hit Ctrl and T on the keyboard to transform the layer and slide it over here. Just nice. I think I'm done with the elements here, so now it's time to focus on color grading and finalizing the look of the artwork. First thing we can do here is create a vignette effect to add some dimension. So add curves, bring the highlights up a little, and the shadows down for some high contrast. I want this effect to be applied around the edges and corners only, so select the mask and use the eraser tool to eliminate the adjustment from the center area. It might be a bit too much, so I'm gonna go back and bring the shadows back up a bit. Much better. Add another curves layer. This time let's lift the shadows up in order to achieve a slightly faded look. Switch over to blue and again lift this up to add a bluish tone to the shadows. Nice. I think we're almost there. I just realized the explosion on the right side needs to emit a bit more light, so this time let's add a hue adjustment layer, enable colorize, add some saturation, bring the lightness up, bring the hue closer to orange, invert the layer mask and simply paint with the brush around the explosion here. There we go. Now it looks a bit more dramatic. I really like this look so far. Perhaps we need a little more contrast here, so let's add a new brightness and contrast adjustment layer. Let's bump up both brightness and contrast. Great, I think it looks really good. You've probably noticed that we can still see a white contour around the subject here. We can still fix that, so let's go back to the models layer mask and simply erase the remaining white pixels around the edges to achieve a cleaner mask. Nice, the colors look great and the main subject looks much cleaner now. And with these final touches, we come to the end of this tutorial. Thank you so much for sticking around up until this point. Give this video a like if you enjoyed the process. Hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more videos like this one. And as usual, feel free to drop any questions, critiques, or requests you have in the comments below. Feel free to share your work with me and the community on Discord. Other than that, stay creative, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.